I went to primary school in the thriving metropolis of Collingbourne-Deuces, somewhere between Andover and Marlborough, and attended there the local Church of England primary school. There was a lovely old school building for the children who were in year 5 and 6, that's the sort of 10 and 11-year-olds, but for all the rest from 4 upwards, there were mobile classrooms, as we called them. They were dressed-up porter cabins, really, prefabricated jobs, temporary in their original intention, although they were put in a good 30 years before I arrived, and they were still there by the end of my school career. They were on stilts. I don't really know why. You had to climb up these sort of rickety wooden steps to get into them. I suppose maybe so they could be laid on non-level ground, and the steps had sort of chicken wire across them, which original intention, I suppose, was to make sure that the steps weren't slippery, and by the time I was there, was the only thing sort of holding the wood together, really. And on the outside, they had this green stippled plaster boarding, painted the colour, presumably of the moss and the lichen that was going to cover them anyway, so that you couldn't really tell. They were dilapidated. They were temporary dwellings, but they were permanent for those of us who were there between the years of 1970 and 2005. The school now has got a new home. Israel was used to temporary dwellings. They were a people who had been forced into fleeing, who had chosen to flee, and whom God had instructed to live their lives in tents for a time, moving from place to place, before he had granted them a promised land to live in, to make their home, to set down permanent roots. And by the time that Isaiah is writing, the prophet whose words we heard first this morning, they do have their own land, and they are meant to be putting down permanent dwellings. The context of the prophecy that we heard is that the leaders of Judah have finally come to understand the threat from the approaching Assyrian army. But instead of repenting to God for the evil that's got them into this predicament, turning back to God, having faith that God will save them in the heat of battle, instead they make an alliance with Egypt. And they feel secure because of it. And they celebrate these new feelings of security and think that they no longer have to fear an Assyrian invasion, no matter the fact that Isaiah is speaking to them again and again in prophecy and oracle, words to the contrary. God calls that deal that they've made with Egypt a covenant of death, the one he spoke of this morning. And he mocks them by saying they're basically rejoicing in finding their rest and their refuge in lies. Rather than putting down permanent buildings, they have made temporary homes of lies, refuges of lies. And he says instead that he will provide a sure place, the Lord, to find refuge, if only his people would trust in him and stand on him, making them their foundation. And in the meantime, these refuges of lies, these agreements and alliances they've made which are not going to save them, he will wash away with the floods that will rise and the hailstones that will come from above. And this is the first place where we get this recurring theme in the biblical imagery of a cornerstone, a firm foundation for the people to rest upon. And it goes on to be a rich resource for the New Testament writers who see in these prophecies allusions to Christ, the cornerstone for the Christian believer. And the idea, at least at the time that Isaiah is writing, is that when you're building a building and digging out the foundations in the beginning, the first thing you need to do after making your hole is to set a foundation stone at the corner. You want it to be large and strong. It needs to bear the weight of one of the columns, the pillars holding up the edge of the building. And most importantly, it needs to be properly square in all directions. You need to make sure that when you build a wall from it down this way, and you build a wall from it down this way and you put a third wall on, that your fourth wall, when you build it, is going to make those two sides meet. It's no good if your foundation stone, from which you're taking the measurements for your wall, is skew-whiff, because one wall goes out this way and the second one comes out here, and once you've built the third one, you'll find that your walls no longer meet up. And not only does it have to be straight in those directions, it needs to be cemented down nice and flat, because this is the stone on which you'll lay the bricks that go up as well. And those bricks need to make sure they're going up straight, so that you don't end up with a wonky building, even if all the walls meet up. That's the idea, that it is the most important first block that sets the pace for the rest of the building. And the way that Isaiah uses his imagery is he talks about making judgment, or more properly the word means justice, the measure, the way in which you measure out the length of your walls and your bricks, and righteousness, the plummet, the way that you make sure that things really are properly vertical by dropping a weight off a line. You make sure the walls are the right length, you make sure the building is going up straight, not wonky. And it's meant as a metaphor for the life of the people who are listening to him. It's a rather complex version, all in all, of what the children were no doubt singing about in Sunday school a bit earlier this morning. You remember the wise man built the house upon the rock and the rain comes tumbling down, the parable that Jesus tells his disciples in the Gospels. The floods come up and the rains come down and the floods come up, and the man who's built his house on the sand looks like a fool. I wonder how much of a good image, though, Isaiah's image of this foundation stone is for us today, or how much it no longer really hits the mark. A lot of the society we live in is a throwaway one, where a cornerstone doesn't need to last. There were no cornerstones for my prefabricated classrooms because they weren't meant to last very long. They just needed to be put up, do the job for a while, be thrown away, and the next thing to come in. And this is the way in which we treat a good deal of our lives, or at least some members of our society treat a good deal of their lives. There's no need for a cornerstone. Things don't need to last. They just need to do their job for long enough before we throw them away and buy the next one. Now, this isn't just a rant against the disposable, the temporary, the things that are replaceable. A lot of them are very helpful. My mobile classroom had its use. It provided somewhere for a burgeoning and growing village to educate its children for the best part of 50 years. It was long overdue for demolition, but it did give me an education. And now it's been pulled down, and over the other side of the village, a new school's been built, which is shiny and pristine, but I would have had to walk rather further in the morning to get there. But there is something to be said for things that are built to last, and I suspect that I don't really need to convince the Matins congregation of that truth. And so too in our lives. There are things to be said for that which is built to last. We should build on a sure foundation, a properly squared off block that is set on the level, the foundation that the New Testament authors understand as Christ. And for two reasons. Firstly, because things that are built on a firm foundation are secure. They weather the storms, the hail that comes down and the floods that rise up. They make their way through adversity without failing. They provide resistance to the elements and to the chances and the changes of this life. Firstly, because they are firm and secure. And secondly, and most importantly, because we are investing our time well when we build on firm foundation. Building on a firm foundation is not wasted. A corollary of the throwaway society that we live in is labour saving, the reclamation of time for the use of the individual. There are times in our lives where we are so short of time that we can hardly wonder if we're using it productively. But a plague for many of us, those of us who do have the luxury of choosing how to use our time, is a feeling that we're maybe not making the best of it, the most of it. Even looking back, what is it that I have achieved in this last year, these last 5 years, these last 10 years? What have I done with my life? What did I do last week? What am I doing today? Is what I'm doing worthwhile? And an antidote to that existential worry, I put it to you, is building on stable foundations. If we build on unstable foundations, blocks that are not squared up, then the work that we put in is liable to come to not very much, because when the water rises and the hail falls, a wobbly, tilted building is liable to fall down. And it doesn't matter how pretty and tall your spire is if it's on the ground. But a building that's built, that is to say, a life that is constructed on a firm foundation, is never wasted. So, let, as Isaiah says, justice be the measure of the building you are building, of the life you are constructing. Let righteousness act as the plumb line in your life to ensure that you're building in God's way. And above all, build upon the firm foundation, the squared off block set levelly, which is Christ, the chief cornerstone, who will not let your foot slip, nor will subside from under you. For if you are building firmly upon Christ, then no activity is wasted. Amen.